Hello, and good day, everyone. Hi. Welcome back. My name is Amy. Welcome to Southwest Shakespeare's Storybook Classics Live. We are currently reading Rebecca du Maurier's Jamaica Inn. If you have not listened or watched, not Rebecca, Daphne du Maurier, my apologies. If you have not watched or listened to Rebecca, which is what introduced us to Miss du Maurier, that is available. However, we are a little under halfway through this new one, which is brand new to me. And I think it's really exciting to read new books with people, because then we get conversations that are happening in our comments right now. Good morning, Catherine and Stanley. Hello, nice to virtually read/see both of you this morning. I would agree. First off, yes, thank you, Catherine. I am having a good day. Secondly, I would agree that everyone has their fingers in the pie of this smuggling ring. And we've only met, 6 people so far in Jamaica Inn, not including the carriage driver. And yes, the worst kept secret in the area. I want to know what they're smuggling. I think brandy, based on some of the conversations, but maybe something more nefarious, uncut gems perhaps, or not people, gold maybe? So let's see. When last we met our intrepid heroine, Mary Yellan, she was slowly falling for the bad boy in Gem. And it's Christmas Eve. And yeah, I'm not a fan of her cooking and cleaning for him, but we have learned that Mary is very loyal and kind and hardworking. So maybe she just saw a dirty kitchen and had to fix it. We'll see. Let's see what happens Christmas morning. For those of you following along, we are on page 141, the bottom of page 141, down here. And off we go. Darkness was falling as she crossed the high road and into the yard. As usual, the inn looked dark and uninhabited, with the door bolted and the windows barred. She went round to the back of the house and tapped on the door of the kitchen. It was opened immediately by her aunt, who seemed pale and anxious. "Your uncle has been asking for you all day," she said. "Where have you been? It's nearly 5 o'clock. You've been gone since morning." "I was walking on the moors," replied Mary. "I didn't think it mattered. Why should Uncle Joss ask for me?" She was aware of a little pang of nervousness, and she looked towards his bed in the corner of the kitchen. It was empty. "Where is he gone? Is he better?" "He wanted to sit in the parlor," said her aunt. "He said he was tired of the kitchen. He's been sitting there all afternoon at the window, looking out for you. You must humor him now, Mary, and speak fair to him and not go against him. This is a bad time when he's recovering. He will get a little stronger every day, and he'll be very self-willed, violent perhaps. You'll be careful what you say to him, won't you, Mary?" This was the old Aunt Patience, with nervous hands and twitching mouth, who glanced over her shoulder as she talked. It was pitiable to see her, and Mary caught something of her agitation. "Why should he want to see me?" she said. "He never has anything to say to me. What can he want?" Aunt Patience blinked and worked her mouth. "It's only his fancy," she said. "He mutters and talks to himself. You mustn't pay any attention to what he says at times like these. He's not really himself. I'll go and tell him you're home." She went out of the room and along the passage to the parlor. Mary crossed to the dresser and poured herself out a glass of water from the pitcher. Her throat was very dry. The glass trembled in her hands, and she cursed herself for a fool. She had been bold enough on the moors just now, and no sooner was she inside the inn than her courage must forsake her and leave her quaking and nervous as a child. Aunt Patience came back into the room. "He's quiet for the moment," she whispered. "He's dozed off in the chair. He may sleep now for the evening. We'll have our supper early and get it finished. There's some cold pie for you here." All hunger had gone from Mary, and she had to force her food. She drank 2 cups of scalding tea and then pushed her plate away. Neither of the women spoke. Aunt Patience kept looking towards the door. When they had finished supper, they cleared the things away silently. Mary threw some turf on the fire and crouched beside it. The bitter blue smoke rose in the air, stinging her eyes, but no warmth came to her from the smoldering turf. Outside in the hall, the clock struck 6 o'clock with a sudden whirring note. Mary held her breath as she counted the strokes. They broke upon the silence with deliberation. It seemed an eternity before the last note fell and echoed through the house and died away. The slow ticking of the clock continued. There was no sound from the parlor, and Mary breathed again. Aunt Patience sat at the table, threading a needle and cotton by daylight. Her lips were pursed, and her forehead puckered into a frown as she bent to her task. The long evening passed, and still there was no call from the landlord in the parlor. Mary nodded her head, her eyes closed in spite of herself, and in that stupid, heavy state between sleeping and waking, she heard her aunt move quietly from her chair and put her work away in the cupboard beside the dresser. In a dream, she heard her whisper in her ear, "I'm going to bed. Your uncle won't wake now. He must have settled in for the night. I shan't disturb him." Mary murmured something in reply, and half-consciously she heard the light patter of footsteps on the passage outside and the creaking of the stairs. On the landing above, a door closed softly. Mary felt the lethargy of sleep steal upon her, and her head sank lower into her hands. The slow ticking of the clock made a pattern in her mind, like footsteps dragging on a high road. 1, 2, 1, 2. They followed one another. She was on the moors beside the running brook, and the burden that she carried was heavy, too heavy to bear. If she could lay it aside for a while and rest herself beside the bank and sleep. It was cold, though, much too cold. Her foot was wringing wet from the water. She must pull herself high up in the bank, out of the way. The fire was out. There was no more fire. Mary opened her eyes and saw that she was lying on the floor beside the white ashes of the fire. The kitchen was very cold, and the light was dim. The candle had burnt low. She yawned and shivered and stretched her stiff arms. When she lifted her eyes, she saw the door of the kitchen open very slowly, little by little, an inch at a time. Mary sat without moving, her hands on the cold floor. She waited, and nothing happened. The door moved again, and then was flung wide, crashing against the wall behind it. Joss Merlin stood in the threshold of the room, his arm outstretched, rocking on his 2 feet. At first, she thought he hadn't noticed her. His eyes were fixed on the wall in front of him, and he stood still where he was, without venturing further into the room. She crouched low, her head beneath the level of the table, hearing nothing but the steady thump of her heart. Slowly he turned in her direction and stared at her a moment or two without speaking. When his voice came, it was strained and hoarse, hardly above a whisper. "Who's there?" he said. "What are you doing? Why don't you speak?" His face was a gray mask, drained of its usual color. His bloodshot eyes fastened themselves upon her without recognition. Mary did not move. "Put away that knife," he whispered. "Put it away, I tell you." She stretched her hand along the floor and touched the leg of a chair with the tips of her fingers. She could not hold on to it unless she moved. It was just out of reach. She waited, holding her breath. He stepped forward into the room, his head bent, his 2 hands feeling the air, and he crept slowly along the floor towards her. Mary watched his hands until they were within a yard of her, and she could feel his breath upon her cheek. "Uncle Joss," she said softly. "Uncle Joss." He crouched where he was, staring down at her, and then he leant forward and touched her hair and her lips. "Mary," he said, "is it you, Mary? Why don't you speak to me? Where have they gone? Have you seen them?" "You've made a mistake, Uncle Joss," she said. "There is no one here, only myself. Aunt Patience is upstairs. Are you ill? Can I help you?" He looked about him in the half-light, searching the corners of the room. "They can't scare me," he whispered. "Dead men don't harm the living. They're blotted out like a candle. That's it, isn't it, Mary?" She nodded, watching his eyes. He pulled himself to a chair and sat down, his hands outstretched on the table. He sighed heavily and passed his tongue over his lips. "It's dreams," he said, "all dreams. The faces stand out like live things in the darkness, and I wake with the sweat pouring down my back. I'm thirsty, Mary. Here's the key. Go to the bar and fetch me some brandy. He fumbled in his pocket and produced a bunch of keys. She took them from him, her hand trembling, and slipped out of the room into the passage. She hesitated for a moment outside, wondering whether she should creep upstairs at once to her room and lock the door and leave him to rave alone in the kitchen. She began to tiptoe along the passages to the hall. Suddenly, he shouted to her from the kitchen, "Where are you going? I told you to fetch the brandy from the bar." She heard the chair scrape as he pushed it away from the table. She was too late. She opened the door of the bar and felt in the cupboard amongst the bottles. When she returned to the kitchen, he was sprawled at the table, his head in his hands. At first she thought he was asleep again, but at the sound of her footsteps, he lifted his head and stretched his arms and leant back in the chair. She put the bottle and a glass on the table in front of him. He filled the glass half full and held it between his two hands, watching her all the while over the rim of it. "You're a good girl," he said. "I'm fond of you, Mary. You've got sense, you've got pluck. You'd make a good companion to a man. They ought to have made you a boy." He rolled the brandy around on his tongue, smiling foolishly, and then he winked at her and pointed his finger. "They pay gold for this up country," he said, "the best that money can buy. King George himself hasn't better brandy than this in his cellar. And what do I pay? Not one damned bloody sixpence. We drink free at Jamaica Inn." He laughed and put out his tongue. "It's a hard game, Mary, but it's a man's game for all that. I've risked my neck 10, 20 times. I've had the fellows thundering at my heels with a pistol shot whistling through the air. They can't catch me, Mary. I'm too cunning. I've been at the game too long. Before we came here, I was at Padstow, working from the shore. We ran a luger once a fortnight with the spring tides. There were 5 of us in it, besides myself. But there's no money working in a small way. You've got to do it big, and you've got to take your orders. There's over 100 of us now, working inland to the border from the coast. By God, I have seen blood in my time, Mary, and I've seen men killed a score of times. But this game beats all of it. It's running us side by side with death." He beckoned her to his side, winking again, glancing first over his shoulder to the door. "Here," he whispered. "Come close, down here by my side where I can talk to you. You've got guts in you, I can see that. You're not scared like your aunt. We ought to be partners, you and I." He seized hold of Mary's arm and pulled her on the floor beside his chair. "It's this cursed drink that makes a fool of me," he said. "I'm as weak as a rat when it has a hold of me. You can see that. And I have dreams, nightmares. I see things that never scare me when I'm sober. Damn it, Mary, I've killed men with my own hands, trampled them underwater, beaten them with rocks and stones, and I've never thought no more about it. I've slept in my bed like a child. But when I'm drunk, I see them in my dreams. I see their white-green faces staring at me with their eyes eaten by fish. And some of them are torn, with the flesh hanging on their bones in ribbons, and some of them have seaweed in their hair. There was a woman once, Mary. She was clinging to a raft, and she had a child in her arms. Her hair was streaming down her back. The ship was close in on the rocks, you see, and the sea was as flat as your hand. They were all coming in alive, the whole bunch of them. Why, the water in places didn't come above your waist. She cried out to me to help her, Mary, and I smashed her face in with a stone. She fell back, her hands beating the raft. She let go of the child, and I hit her again. I watched them drown in 4 feet of water. We were scared then. We were afraid some of them would reach the shore. For the first time, we hadn't reckoned on the tide. In half an hour, they'd be walking dry-sod on the sand. We had to pelt at them all with stones, Mary. We had to break their arms, and they drowned there in front of us, like the woman and her child, with the water not up to their shoulders. They drowned because we smashed them with rocks and stones. They drowned because they couldn't stand. His face was close to Mary, his red-flecked eyes staring into her and his breath on her neck. "Do you ever hear of wreckers before?" he whispered. Outside in the passage, the clock struck 1 o'clock, and the single note rang in the air like a summons. Neither of them moved. The room was very cold, and the fire had sunk away to nothing, and a little current of air blew in from the open door. The yellow flame of the candle bowed and flickered. He reached out to her and took her hand. It lay limp in his, like a dead hand. Perhaps he saw something of the frozen horror on her face, for he let her go and turned away his eyes. He stared straight before him at the empty glass, and he began to drum with his fingers on the table. Crouching on the floor beside him, Mary watched a fly crawl across his hand. She watched it pass through the short black hairs and over the thick veins of the knuckles, and it ran to the tips of the long, slim fingers. She remembered the swift and sudden grace of those fingers when they cut bread for her that first morning, and how, if they chose, they could be delicate and light. She watched them drumming now on the table, and in her fancy she saw them curl around a block of jagged stone and fasten upon it. She saw the stone flying through the air. Once more he turned to her, his whisper hoarse, and he jerked his head towards the ticking of the clock. "The sound of it rings in my head sometimes," he said, "and when it struck 1 just now, it was like the tolling of a bell buoy on a bay. I've heard it come traveling down the air in the westerly wind. 1, 2, 1, 2, backwards and forwards the clapper goes against the bell, as though it tolled for dead men. I've heard it in my dreams. I heard it tonight. A mournful, weary sound, Mary, is a bell buoy out on the bay. It rubs on your nerves and you want to scream. When you work on the coast, you have to pull them out on a boat and muffle them, wrap the tongue in flannel. That deadens them. There's silence then. Maybe it's a misty night with patches of white fog on the water, and outside the bay there'll be a ship casting for scent like a hound. She listens for the buoy, and no sound comes to her. She comes in then, driving through the fog. She comes straight to us who are waiting for her, Mary, and we see her shudder suddenly and strike, and then the surf has her." He reached for the bottle of brandy and let a little liquid trickle slowly into the glass. He smelt it and rolled it on his tongue. "Have you ever seen flies caught in a jar of treacle?" he said. "I've seen men like that, stuck in the rigging like a swarm of flies. They cling there for safety, shouting in terror at the sight of the surf. Just like flies they are, spread out on the yards, little black dots of men. I've seen the ship break up beneath them, and the masts and yards snap like thread, and there they'll be flung into the sea to swim for their lives. But when they reach the shore, they're dead men, Mary." He wiped his mouth on the back of his hands and stared at her. "Dead men tell no tales, Mary," he said. His face nodded to hers and narrowed suddenly and was blotted out. No longer was she kneeling on the kitchen floor, her hands gripping the table. She was a child again, running beside her father on the cliffs beyond St. Catherine. He swung her up onto her shoulder, and there were other men running with them who shouted and cried. Somebody pointed to the distant sea, and clinging to her father's head, she saw a great white ship like a bird rolling helplessly on the trough of the sea, her masts broken short and her sails trailing in the water beside her. "What are they doing?" asked the child that had been herself, and nobody answered her. They stood where they were, staring in horror at the ship that rolled and plunged. "God have mercy upon them," said her father, and the child Mary began to cry, calling for her mother, who came at once from amongst the crowd and took her into her arms and walked away with her out of sight of the sea. There all the memory snapped and vanished, and there was no ending to the story. But when she grew to understanding and was no longer a child, her mother would talk of the day they had gone to St. Catherine when a great bark had sunk with all on board, her back broken on the dreaded manacles. Mary shivered and sighed, and once more her uncle's face loomed before her in its frame of matted hair, and she was kneeling beside him again in the kitchen at Jamaica Inn. She felt deadly sick, and her hands and feet were icy cold. She longed only to stumble to her bed and bury her head in her hands, pulling the blanket and pillow over her for greater darkness. Perhaps if she pressed her hands against her eyes, she would blot out his face and the pictures he had painted for her. Perhaps if she thrust her fingers in her ears, she would muffle the sounds of his voice and the thunder of the surf upon the shore. Here she could see the pale faces of drowned men, their arms above their heads. She could hear the screams of terror and the cries. She could hear the mournful clamor of the bell buoy as it swayed backwards and forwards on the sea. Mary shivered again. She looked up at her uncle and saw that he had sloped forward on his chair and his head had fallen on his chest. His mouth was wide open, and he snorted and sputtered as he slept. His long, dark lashes swept his cheeks like a fringe. His arms rested on the table before him, and his hands were clasped as though in prayer. Man, Joss has done some things. I don't know why. I was slightly maybe taken aback. I guess surprised might not be the right answer, Catherine. I mean, the right word for me, at least. I'm always taken aback when murder of the innocent happens, no matter who it is. So yes, I think I knew he's capable, but then to like hear him say it with no remorse. Whoa. All right, let's go to Christmas, shall we? Chapter 9. On Christmas Eve, the sky was overcast and threatened rain. It had turned mild, too, in the night, and the mud in the yard was churned where the cows had trodden. The walls of Mary's bedroom felt damp to her hand, and there was a great yellow patch in one corner caused by the shrinking plaster. Mary leant out of the window, and the soft, wet wind blew upon her face. In an hour's time, Jem Merlin would be waiting for her on the moor to take her to Launceston's Fair. Whether she met him or not depended upon herself, and she could not make up her mind. She had grown older in 4 days, and the face that looked back at her from the spotted, cracked mirror was drawn and tired. There were dark rings beneath her eyes and little hollows in her cheeks. Sleep came late to her at night, and she had no appetite for food. For the first time in her life, she saw a resemblance between herself and her Aunt Patience. They had the same pucker of the forehead and the same mouth. If she pursed her lips and worked them, biting the edges, it might be Aunt Patience who stood there with the lank brown hair framing her face. The trick was an easy one to catch, as was the nervous twisting of the hands, and Mary turned away from the telltale mirror and began to pace up and down in her cramped room. During the past few days, she had kept as much as possible to the privacy of her own room, excusing herself on the score of a chill. Mary could not trust herself to speak to her aunt at present, not for any length of time. Her eyes would have betrayed her. They would look at one another with the same dumb horror, the same hidden anguish, and Aunt Patience would have understood. They shared a secret now, a secret that must never be spoken between them. Mary wondered how many years Aunt Patience had kept that knowledge to herself in an agony of silence. No one would ever know how greatly she had suffered. Wherever she would go in the future, the pain of that knowledge would go with her. It would never leave her alone. At last, Mary was able to understand the pale, twitching face, the hands that plucked at the dress, the wide, staring eyes. The evidence screamed at her now that she knew. At first, she had felt sick, deadly sick. She had lain on her bed that night, praying for the mercy of sleep, and it had been denied her. There were faces in the darkness that she had not known, the worn and weary faces of drowned people. There was a child with broken wrists, and a woman whose long, wet hair clung to her face, and the screaming, frightened faces of men who had never learned to swim. Sometimes it seemed to her that her own mother and father were amongst them. They looked up at her with wide eyes and pallid lips, and they stretched out their hands. Perhaps this is what Aunt Patience suffered, alone in her room at night. The faces came to her, too, and pleaded, and she pushed them away. She would not give them release. In her own way, Aunt Patience was a murderer too. She had killed them by her silence. Her guilt was as great as Joss Merlin's himself, for she was a woman and he was a monster. He was bound to her flesh, and she let him remain. Now that it was the third day and the first horror had passed, Mary felt indifferent, rather old, and very tired. Most of the feeling had gone from her. It seemed to her that she had always known now. At the back of her mind, she had been prepared. The first sight of Joss Merlin standing beneath the porch with a lantern in his hands had been a warning, while the sound of the coach rattled away down the high road and out of her hearing had rung like a farewell. In the old days at Helford, there had been whispers of these things, little snatches of gossip overheard in the village lanes, a fragrance of a story, a denial, a shake of the head, but men did not talk much, and the stories were discouraged. 20, 50 years ago, perhaps, when her father had been young, but not now, not in the light of the new century. Once more she saw her uncle's face pressed close to hers, and she heard him whisper in her ear, "Did you ever hear of wreckers before?" These were words that she had never heard breathed, but Aunt Patience had lived amongst them for 10 years. Mary did not consider her uncle anymore. She had lost her fear of him. There was only loathing left in her heart, loathing and disgust. He had lost all hold on humanity. He was a beast that walked by night. Now that she had seen him drunk and she knew him for what he was, he could not frighten her. Neither he nor the rest of his company. They were things of evil, rotting the countryside, and she would never rest until they were trodden underfoot and cleared and blotted out. Sentiment could not save them again. There remained Aunt Patience and Jem Merlin. He broke into her thoughts against her will, and she did not want him. There was enough on her mind without reckoning with Jim. He was too like his brother, his eyes and his mouth and his smile. That was the danger of it. She could see her uncle in his walk and the turn of his head, and she knew why Aunt Patience had made a fool of herself 10 years ago. It would be easy enough to fall in love with Jem Merlin. Men had not counted for much in her life up to the present. There had been too much to do on the farm at Helford to worry about them. There had been lads who had smiled at her in church and gone with her to picnics harvest time. Once a neighbor had kissed her behind a hayrack after a glass of cider. It was all very foolish, and she had avoided the man ever since. A harmless enough fellow, too, who had forgotten the incident 5 minutes later. Anyway, she would never marry. It was a long while since she had decided that. She would save money in some way and do a man's work on a farm. Once she got away from Jamaica Inn and could put it behind her and make some sort of home for Aunt Patience, she was not likely to have time on her hands to think of men. And there, in spite of herself, came Jem's face again, with the growth of beard like a tramp and his dirty shirt and his bold, offensive stare. He lacked tenderness, he was rude, and he had more than a streak of cruelty in him. He was a thief and a liar. He stood for everything she feared and hated and despised, but she knew she could love him. Nature cared nothing for prejudice. Men and women were like the animals on the farm at Helford, she supposed. There was a common law of attraction for all living things, some similarity of skin or touch, and they would go to one another. This was no choice made with the mind. Animals did not reason, neither did the birds in the air. Mary was no hypocrite. She was bred to the soil, and she had lived too long with birds and beasts, and had watched them mate and bear their young and die. There was precious little romance in nature, and she would not look for it in her own life. She had seen the girls at home walk with the village lads, and there would be a holding of hands and a blushing and confusion and long-drawn sighs and a gazing at the moonlight on the water. Mary would see them wander down the grass lane at the back of the farm. Lover's Lane, they called it, though the older men had a better word for it than that. And the lad would have his arm around the waist of his girl, and she with her head on his shoulder. They would look up at the stars and the moon, or the flaming sunset if it was summer weather. And Mary, coming out of the cowshed, wiped the sweat from her face with dripping hands and thought of the newborn calf she had left beside its mother. She looked after the departing couple and smiled, shrugged her shoulders, and, going into the kitchen, she told her mother there would be a wedding in Helford before the month was past. And then the bells would ring, the cake would be cut, and the lad on his Sunday clothes would stand on the steps of the church with shining face and shuffling feet, with his bride beside him dressed in muslin, her straight hair curled for the occasion. But before the year was out, the moon and the stars could shine all night for all they cared, for when the lad came home at evening, tired from his work in the fields, and carling sharply that his supper was burnt, not fit for a dog, while the girl snapped back at him from the bedroom overhead, her figure sagging and her curls gone, pacing backwards and forwards with a bundle in her arms that mewed like a cat and would not sleep. There was no talk then of the moonlight on the water. No, Mary had no illusions about romance. Falling in love was a pretty name for it, that was all. Jem Merlin was a man, and she was a woman, and whether it was his hands or his skin or his smile, she did not know, but something inside her responded to him, and the very thought of him was an irritant and a stimulant at the same time. It nagged at her and would not let her be. She knew she would have to see him again. Once more she looked up at the gray sky and the low-flying clouds. If she was going to Lawston, then it was time to make ready and be away. There would be no excuses to make. She'd grown hard in the last 4 days. Aunt Patience could think what she liked. If she had any intuition, she must guess that Mary did not want to see her. And she would look at her husband with his bloodshot eyes and his shaking hands, and she would understand. Once more, perhaps for the last time, the drink had loosened his tongue. His secret was spilt, and Mary held his future in her hands. She had not yet determined what use to make of her knowledge, but she would not save him again. Today she would go to Lawston with Jem Merlin, and this time it was he who would answer her questions. He would show some humility, too, when she realized he was no longer afraid of them, but could destroy them when she chose. And tomorrow, well, tomorrow would take care of itself. There was always Francis Davy and his promise. There would be peace and shelter for her at the house in Alternon. This was a strange Christmastide, she pondered, as she strode across the East Moor with Hawk Tor as her guide, and the hills rolling away from her on either side. Last year, she had knelt beside her mother in church and prayed that health and strength and courage should be given to them both. She had prayed for peace of mind and security, and she had asked that her mother might be spared for her long, and that the farm should prosper. For answer came sickness and poverty and death. She was alone now, caught in a mesh of brutality and crime, living beneath a roof she loathed amongst people she despised. And she was walking out across a barren, friendless moor to meet a horse thief and a murderer of men. She would offer no prayers to God this Christmas. Mary waited on the high ground above Rushford, and in the distance she saw the little cavalcade approach her, the pony, the jingle, and 2 horses tethered behind. The driver raised his whip in a signal of welcome. Mary felt the color flame into her face and drain away. This weakness was a thing of torment to her, and she longed for it to be tangible and alive so that she could tear it from her and trample it underfoot. She thrust her hands into her shawl and waited, her forehead puckered in a frown. He whistled as he approached her and flung a small package at her feet. "A happy Christmas to you. I had a silver piece in my pocket yesterday, and it burnt a hole. There's a new handkerchief for your head." She had meant to be curt and silent upon meeting him, but this introduction made it difficult for her. "That is very kind of you," she said. "I'm afraid you wasted your money all the same." "That doesn't worry me. I'm used to it," he told her, and he looked her up and down in the cool, offensive way of his and whistled a tuneless song. "You're early here," he said. "Were you afraid I'd be going without you?" She climbed into the cart beside him and gathered the reins in her hands. "I like to have the feel of them again," she said, ignoring his remark. "Mother and we would drive into Helston once a week on market days. It all seems very long ago. I have a pain in my heart when I think of it, and how we used to laugh together, even when times were bad. You wouldn't understand that, of course. You've never cared for anything but yourself." He folded his arms and watched her handle the reins. "That pony could cross the moor blindfold," he told her. "Give him his head, can't you? He's never stumbled in his life. That's better. He's taking charge of you, remember, and you can leave him to it. What were you saying?" Mary held the reins lightly in her hands and looked at the track ahead of her. "Nothing very much," she answered. "In a way, I was talking to myself. So you're going to sell 2 ponies at the fair, then?" "Double profit, Mary Yellan, and you shall have a new dress if you help me. Don't smile and shrug your shoulder. I hate ingratitude. What's the matter with you today? Your color is gone. You've no light in your eyes. Are you feeling sick, or do you have a pain in your belly?" "I've not been out of the house since I saw you last," she said. "I've stayed up in my room with my thoughts. They didn't make cheerful company. I'm a deal older than I was 4 days ago. Sorry you've lost your looks," he went on. "I fancied jogging into Lawston with a pretty girl beside me and fellows looking at me as we passed and winking. You're drab today." "Don't lie to me, Mary. I'm not as blind as you think. What happened at Jamaica Inn?" "Nothing happened," she said. My aunt patters about in the kitchen, and my uncle sits at the table with his head in his hands and a bottle of brandy in front of him. It's only myself that has changed. You've had no visitors, have you? None that I know of. Nobody crossed the yard. Your mouth is set very firm, and there are smudges under your eyes. You're tired. I've seen a woman look like that before, but there was a reason for it. Her husband came back to her at Plymouth after 4 years at sea. You can't make that excuse. Have you been thinking about me by any chance? Yes, I have thought about you once, she said. I wondered who would hang first, you or your brother. There's little in it from what I can see. If Joss hangs, it will be his own fault, said Jem. If ever a man puts a rope around his own neck, he does. He goes 3/4 of the way to meet trouble. When it does get him, it will serve him right, and there will be no brandy bottle to save him then. He'll swing sober. They jogged along in silence, Jem playing with the thong of the whip and Mary aware of his hands beside her. She glanced down at them out of the tail of her eye, and she saw they were long and slim. They had the same grace, the same strength as his brothers. These attracted her. The others repelled her. She realized for the first time that aversion and attraction ran side by side, and the boundary line was thin between them. The thought was an unpleasant one, and she shrank from it. Supposing this had been Joss beside her 10, 20 years ago. She shuddered the comparison in the back of her mind, fearing the picture it conjured. She knew now why she hated her uncle. His voice broke in upon her thoughts. What are you looking at? He said. She shifted her eyes to the scene in front of her. I happen to notice your hands, she said briefly, if they're like your brother's. How far do we go across the moor? Isn't that the high road winding away yonder? We strike it lower down and miss 2 or 3 miles of it. So, you notice a man's hands, do you? I should never have believed it of you. You're a woman, after all, then, and not a half-fledged farm boy. Are you going to tell me why you've sat in your room for 4 days without speaking, or do you want me to guess? Women love to be mysterious. There's no mystery in it. You asked me last time we met if I knew why my aunt looked like a living ghost. Those were your words, weren't they? Well, I know now, that's all. Jem watched her with curious eyes, and then he whistled again. Drink's a funny thing, he said after a moment or two. I got drunk once in Amsterdam the time I ran away to sea. I remember hearing a church clock strike 9:30 in the evening, and I was sitting on the floor with my arms around a pretty red-haired girl. Next thing I knew, it was 7 the following morning, and I was lying on my back in the gutter without any boots or breeches. I have to wonder what I did in those 10 hours. I have thought and thought, but I'm damned if I can remember. That's very fortunate for you, said Mary. Your brother is not so lucky. When he gets drunk, he finds his memory instead of losing it. The pony slacked in his stride, and she flicked at him with the reins. If he's alone, he can talk to himself, she continued. It wouldn't have much effect on the walls of Jamaica Inn. This time, he was not alone, though. I happened to be there when he spoke from his stupor, and he'd been dreaming. And when you heard one of his dreams, you shut yourself in your bedroom for 4 days, is that it? Said Jem. That's as near as you'll ever get to it, she replied. He leant over her suddenly and took the reins out of her hands. You don't look where you're going, he said. I told you this pony never stumbled, but it doesn't mean you have to drive him into a block of granite the size of a cannonball. Give him to me. She sank back in the jingle and allowed him to drive. It was true. She had lacked concentration and then deserved his reproach. The pony picked up his feet and broke into a trot. What are you going to do about it? Said Jem. Mary shrugged her shoulders. I haven't made up my mind, she said. I have to consider Aunt Patience. You don't expect me to tell, do you? Why not? I hold no brief for Joss. You're his brother, and that's enough for me. There are many gaps in the story, and you fit remarkably well into some of them. Do you think I'd waste my time working for my brother? There'd be little waste of time from what I've seen. There's profit enough and to spare in his business, and no payment in return for his goods. Dead men tell no tales, Jem Merlin. No, but dead ships do, when they run ashore in a fair wind. It's lights a vessel looks for, Mary, when she's seeking harbor. Have you ever seen a moth flutter to a candle and singe his wings? A ship will do the same to a false light. It may happen once, twice, 3 times perhaps, For the fourth time, a dead ship sinks to heaven, and the whole country is up in arms and wants to know the reason why. My brother has lost his own rudder by now, and he's heading for the shore himself. Will you keep him company? I? What have I got to do with him? He can run his own head into the noose. I may have helped myself to a backing now and then, and I've run cargoes, but I'll tell you one thing, Mary Yellan, and you can believe it or not as the mood takes you. I've never killed a man. Yet. He cracked the whip savagely over the pony's head, and the animal broke into a gallop. There's a ford ahead of us where that hedge runs away to the east. We cross the river and come out to the Launceston Road, half-mile in. When we've 7 miles or more we've 7 miles or more before we reach the town. You getting tired? She shook her head. There's bread and cheese in the basket under the seat, and an apple or two and some pears. You'll be hungry directly. So you think I wreck ships, do you, and stand on the shore and watch men drown, and then put my hands into their pockets afterwards when they've swollen with water? Makes a pretty picture. Whether his anger was pretend or sincere, she could not say, but his mouth was set firm, and there was a flaming spot of color high on his cheekbone. You haven't denied it yet, have you? She said. He looked down at her with insolence, half contemptuous, half amused, and he laughed as though she were a child without knowledge. She hated him for it, and with a sudden intuition, she knew the question that was forming itself, and her hands grew hot. If you believe it of me, why do you drive with me today to Launceston? He said. He was ready to mock her. An evasion or a stammering reply would be a triumph for him, and she steeled herself to gaiety. For the sake of your bright eyes, Jem Merlin, she said, I ride with you for no other reason. And she met his glance without a tremor. He laughed at that and shook his head and fell into whistling again. And all at once there was an ease between them and a certain boyish familiarity. The very boldness of her words had disarmed him. He suspected nothing of the weakness that lay behind them. For the moment they were companions without the strain of being man and woman. They came now to the high road, and the jingle rattled along behind the trotting pony with the 2 stolen horses clattering in tow. The rain clouds swept across the sky, threatening and low, but as yet no drizzle fell from them, and the hills that rose into the distance from the moors were clear of mist. Mary thought of Francis Davy and Algernon away from the left of her, and she wondered what he would say to her when she told him her story. He would not advise a waiting game again. Perhaps he would not thank her if she broke upon his Christmas, and she pictured the silent vicarage, peaceful and still amongst the clutter of cottages that formed the village, the tall church tower standing like a guardian above the roof and chimneys. There was a haven of rest for her in Algernon. The very names spelt like a whisper, and the voice of Francis Davy would mean security and a forgetting of trouble. There was a strangeness about him that was disturbing and pleasant. That picture he had painted, and the way he had driven his horse, and how he had waited upon her with deft silence. And strange above all was the gray and somber stillness of his room that bore no trace of his personality. He was a shadow of a man, and now she was not with him. He lacked substance. He had not the male aggression of Jem beside her. He was without flesh and blood. He was no more than 2 white eyes and a voice in the darkness. The pony shied suddenly at a gap in the hedge, and Jem's loud curse broke her with a jar from the privacy of her thoughts. She threw a shot at a venture. Are there churches hereabout? She asked him. I've lived like a heathen these last months, and I hate that feeling. Get out of it, you blasted fool, you! Shouted Jem, stabbing at the pony's mouth. Do you want us to land us all in a ditch? Churches, you say? How the hell should I know about churches? I've only been inside one once, and then I was carried in my mother's arm, and I came out Jeremiah. I can't tell you anything about them. They keep the gold plate locked up, I believe. Well, there's a church at Algernon, isn't there? She said. That's within walking distance of Jamaica Inn. I might go there tomorrow. Far better eat your Christmas dinner with me. I can't give you turkey, but I can always help myself to a goose from old Farmer Tuckett at North Hill. He's getting so blind he'd never know she was missing. Do you know who has the living in Algernon, Jem Merlin? No, I do not, Mary Yellan. I've never had any truck with persons, and I'm never likely to. They're a funny breed of man altogether. There was a person at North Hill when I was a boy who was very short-sighted, and they say one Sunday he mislaid the sacramental wine and gave the parish brandy instead. The village heard in a body that was happening, and do you know, that church was so packed there was scarcely room to kneel. There were people standing up against the walls, waiting their turn. The parson couldn't make it out at all. There'd never been so many people in his church before, and he got right up to the pulpit with his eyes shining behind his spectacles, and he preached a sermon about the flock returning to the fold. Brother Matthew, it was, told me the story. He went up twice to the altar rails, and the parson never noticed. It was a great dale at North Hill. Get out the bread and the cheese, Mary. My belly is sinking away to nothing. Mary shook her head at him and sighed. Have you ever been serious about anything in your life? She said. Do you respect nothing and nobody? I respect my inside, he told her, and it's calling out for food. That's the box under my feet. You can eat the apple if you're feeling religious. There's an apple and comes in the Bible. I know that much. It was a hilarious and rather heated cavalcade that clattered into Launceston for 2:30 in the afternoon. Mary had thrown trouble and responsibility to the winds, and in spite of her firm resolution of the early morning, she had melted to Jem's mood and given herself to gaiety. Away from the shadow of Jamaica Inn, her natural youth and her spirits returned, and her companion noticed this in a flash and played upon them. She laughed because she must, and because he made her, and there was an infection in the air caught from the sound and bustling of the town, a sense of excitement and well-being, a sense of Christmas. The streets were thronged with people, and the little shops were gay. Carriages and carts and coaches, too, were huddled together in the cobbled square. There was color and life and movement. The cheerful crowd jostled one another before the market stalls. Turkey and geese scratched at the wooden barrier that penned them, and a woman in a green cloak held apples above her head and smiled, the apples shining and red like her cheeks. The scene was familiar and dear. Helston had been like this, year after year at Christmas time. But there was a brighter, more abandoned spirit about Launceston. The crowd was greater and the voices mixed. There was space here and a certain sophistication. Devonshire and England were across the river. Farmers from the next county rubbed shoulders with countrywomen from East Cornwall. And there were shopkeepers and pastry cooks and little apprentice boys who pushed in and out amongst the crowd with hot pastries and sausage meat on trays. A lady in a feathered hat and a blue velvet cape stepped down from her coach and went into the warmth and light of the hospitable White Hart, followed by a gentleman in a padded greatcoat of powder gray. He lifted his eyeglasses to his eyes and strutted after her for all the world like a turkey cock himself. This was a gay and happy world to Mary. The town was set on the bosom of a hill, with a castle framed in the center, like a tale from an old history. There were trees clustered here, and sloping fields, and water gleamed in the valley below. The moors were remote. They stretched away out of sight behind the town and were forgotten. Launceston had a real reality. These people were alive. Christmas came into its own again in the town and had a place amongst the cobbled streets. The laughing, jostling crowd, and the watering sun struggled from its hiding place behind the gray, banked clouds to join the festivity. Mary wore the handkerchief Jem had given her. She even unbent so far as to permit him to tie the ends under her chin. They had stabled the pony and jingle at the top of the town, and now Jem pushed his way through the crowd, leading his 2 stolen horses. Mary followed at his heels. He led the way with confidence, making straight for the main square where the whole of Launceston gathered and the booths and tents of the Christmas fair stood end to end. There was a place roped off from the fair for the buying and selling of livestock, and the ring was surrounded by farmers and countrymen, gentlemen too, and dealers from Devon and beyond. Mary's heart beat faster as they approached the ring. Supposing there was someone from North Hill here, or a farmer from a neighboring village, surely they would recognize the horse. Jem wore his hat at the back of his head, and he whistled. He looked back at her once and winked his eye. The crowd parted and made way for him. Mary stood on the outskirts behind a fat market woman with a basket, and she saw Jem take his place amongst a group of men with ponies, and he nodded to one or two of them and ran his eye over the ponies, bending as he did to light his pipe. He looked cool and unperturbed. Presently, a flashing-looking fellow with a square hat and cream breeches thrust his way through the crowd and crossed over to the horses. His voice was loud and important, and he kept hitting his boot with the crop and then pointing to the ponies. From his tone and his air of authority, Mary judged him to be a dealer. Soon he was joined by a little lynx-eyed man in a black coat, who now and again jogged his elbow and whispered in his ear. Mary saw him stare hard at the black pony that had belonged to Squire Bassett. He went up to him, bent down and felt his legs. Then he whispered something in the ear of the loud-voiced man. Mary watched him nervously. "Where'd you get this pony?" said the dealer, tapping Jem on the shoulder. "He was never bred on the moors, not with that head and shoulders." "He was foaled at Callington 4 years ago," said Jem carelessly, his pipe on the corner of his mouth. "I bought him as a yearling from old Tim Bray. You remember Tim? He sold up last year and went to Dorset. Tim always told me I'd get my money back on this pony. The dam was Irish bred and won prizes for him up country. Have a look at him, won't you? But he's not going cheap, I'll tell you that." He puffed at his pipe while the two men went over the pony carefully. The time seemed endless before they straightened themselves and stood back. Just checking pages. "Had any trouble with his skin?" said the lynx-eyed man. "Feels very coarse on the surface and sharp, like bristles. There's a taint about him, too. I don't like it. You haven't been doping him, have you?" "There's nothing ailing with that pony," replied Jem. "The one over there, he fell away to nothing in the summer, but I brought him back all right. I'd do better to keep him till the spring now, I believe, but he's costing me money. No, this black pony here, can't fault him. I'll be frank with you over one thing, and that's only fair to admit it. Old Tim Bray never knew the mare was in foal. He was in Plymouth at the time, and his boy was looking after him. And when he found out, he gave the boy a thrashing, but of course it was too late. He had to make the best of a bad job. It's my opinion the sire was a gray. Look at the short hair there close to the skin. That's gray, isn't it? Tim just missed a good bargain with his pony. Look at those shoulders. There's breeding for you. Tell you what, I'll take 18 guineas for him." The lynx-eyed man shook his head, but the dealer hesitated. "Make it 15 and we might do business," he suggested. "Nope, 18 guineas is my sum and not a penny less." The two men consulted together and appeared to disagree. Mary heard the word fake, and Jem shot a glance over their heads to the crowd. A little murmur rose up from the group of men beside him. Once more, the lynx-eyed man bent and touched the legs of the black pony. "I'd advise another opinion on this pony. I'm not satisfied about him myself. Where's your mark?" Jem showed him the narrow slit in the ear, and the man examined it closely. "You're a sharp customer, aren't you?" said Jem. "Anyone would think I'd stolen the horse. Anything wrong with the mark?" "No, apparently not. It's a good thing for you that Tim Bray has gone to Dorset. He never owned this pony, whatever you say. I wouldn't touch him, Stevens, if I were you. You'll find yourself in trouble. Come away, man." The loudmouth dealer looked regretfully at the black pony. "He's a good looker," he said. "I don't care who bred him or if his sire was piebald. What makes you so particular, Will?" Once more, the lynx-eyed man plucking at his sleeve and whispered to his ear. The dealer listened, pulled a face, and then he added, "All right." And aloud he said, "I've no doubt that you're right. You've got an eye for trouble, haven't you? Perhaps we're better out of it. You can keep your pony," he added to Jem. "My partner doesn't fancy him. Take my advice and come down on your price. If you have him for long in your hands, you'll be sorry." And he elbowed his way through the crowd with the lynx-eyed man beside him, and they disappeared into the direction of the White Hart. Mary breathed a sigh of relief when she saw the last of them. She could make nothing of Jem's expression. His lips were framed in the inevitable whistle. People came and went. The shaggy moorland ponies were sold for £2 or £3 apiece, and their late owners departed, satisfied. No one came near the black pony again. He was looked at askance by the crowd. At 3:45, Jem sold the other horse for £6 to a cheerful, honest-looking farmer after a long and very good-humored argument. The farmer declared he would give £5, and Jem stuck out for 7. After 20 minutes riotous bargaining, the sum of £6 was agreed, and the farmer rode off on the back of his purchase with a grin from ear to ear. Mary began to flag on her feet. Twilight gathered in the market square, and the lamps were lit. The town wore an air of mystery. She was thinking of returning to the jingle when she heard a woman's voice behind her and a high, affected laugh. She turned and saw the blue cloak and the plumed hat of the woman who had stepped from the coach earlier in the afternoon. "Oh, look, James," she was saying. "Did you ever see such a delicious pony in your life? He holds his head just like poor Beauty did. The likeness would be quite striking, only this animal, of course, is black and has nothing of Beauty's breeding. What a nuisance Roger isn't here. I can't disturb him from his meeting. What do you think of him, James?" His companion put up his eyeglasses and stared. "Damn it, Maria," he drawled. "I don't know a thing about horses. The pony you lost was gray, wasn't it? This thing is ebony, positively ebony, my dear. Do you want to buy him?" The woman gave a little trill of laughter. "It would be such a good Christmas present for the children," she said. "They've plagued poor Roger ever since Beauty disappeared. Ask the price, James, will you?" The man strutted forward. "Here, my good fellow," he called to Jem. "Do you want to sell that black pony of yours?" Jem shook his head. "He's promised to a friend," he said. "I wouldn't like to go back on my word. Besides, I wouldn't carry you. He's ridden by children." "Oh, really? Oh, I see. Well, thank you. Maria, this fellow says the pony is not for sale." "Is he sure? What a sham I had let my heart on him. I'll pay him his price, tell him. Ask him again, James." Once more, the man put on his glasses and drawled, "Look here, my man, this lady has taken a fancy to your pony. She just lost one. She wants to replace him. Her children will be most disappointed if they hear about it. Damn your friend, you know. He must wait. What's your price?" 25 guineas, said Jem promptly. "At least that's what my friend was going to pay. I'm not anxious to sell him." The lady in the plumed hat swept into the ring. "I'll give you 30 for him," she said. "I'm Mrs. Bassett from North Hill, and I want the pony as a Christmas present for my children. Please don't be obstinate. I have half the sum here in my purse, and this gentleman will give you the rest. Mr. Bassett is in Launceston now, and I want the pony to be a surprise for him as well as to my children. My groom shall fetch the pony immediately and ride into North Hill before Mr. Bassett leaves the town. Here's the money." Jem swept off his hat and bowed low. "Thank you, ma'am," he said. "I hope Mr. Bassett will be pleased with your bargain. You'll find the pony exceedingly safe with children." "Oh, I'm certain he will be delighted. Of course the pony is nothing like the one he had stolen. Beauty was a thoroughbred and worth a great deal of money. This little animal's handsome enough and will please the children. Come along, James. It's getting quite dark and I'm chilled to the bone." She made her way from the ring towards the coach that waited in the square. The tall footman leapt forward to open the door. "I just bought a pony for Master Robert and Master Henry," she said. "Will you find Richards and tell him that he's to ride it back home? I want it to be a surprise for the squire." She stepped into the coach, and her petticoats fluttering about her, followed by her companion with the monocle. Jem looked hastily over his shoulder and tapped a lad who stood beside him in the arm. "Here, would you like a 5-shilling piece?" The lad nodded, his mouth agape. "Hang on to this pony, then, and when the groom comes for him, hand him over for me, will you? I've just had word that my wife has given birth to twins and her life is in danger. I haven't a moment to lose. Here, take the bridle. A happy Christmas to you." And he was off in a moment, walking hard against the square, his hands thrust deep into his breeches pockets. Mary followed, a discreet 10 paces behind. Her face was scarlet, and she kept her eyes on the ground. The laughter bubbled up inside her, and she hid her mouth in her shawl. She was near to collapsing when they reached the further side of the square, out of sight of the coach and the group of people, and she stood with her hand to her side, catching her breath. Jem waited for her, his face as grave as a judge. "Jem Merlin, you deserve to be hanged," she said when she had recovered herself. "To stand there, as you did in the market square, and sell that stolen pony back to Mrs. Bassett herself? You have the cheek of the devil, and the hairs in my head have gone gray from watching you." He threw back his head and laughed, and she could not resist him. Their laughter echoed in the street until people turned to look at them, and they too caught the infection and smiled and broke into laughter. And Launceston itself seemed to rock in merriment as peal after peal of gaiety echoed in the street, mingling with the bustle and clatter of the fair. And with it all, there was shouting and calling and a song from somewhere. The torches and the flares cast strange lights on the faces of people, and there was color and shadow and the hum of voices and a ripple of excitement in the air. Jem caught her hand and crumpled the fingers. "You're glad you came now, aren't you?" he said. And "Yes," she said recklessly, and she did not mind. Bless you. I'm going to pause there, stop there until next time. We still have about 10 pages again of the chapter. So we are on page 175 when we come back. We just, oh, Jem. Yeah, I know. I kind of want to be a fly on the wall when Mr. Bassett comes and picks up the new horse and then gives it a bath and then finds out that it's Beauty. Well done, Jem. Terrible, terrible way of doing it, but well done. So when we come back, when we meet again, 175, right before chapter 10, and we will find out what else they get up to in the strange, strange world of the Christmas fair at Launceston. Thank you both for joining, and anyone else who joined us today. Again, this is Jamaica Inn. We will join page 1. Where's my trusty bookmark? 175 next time. Until then, be safe, drink lots of water, have a fantastic day, and I will see you next time. Bye, everybody.